Okay, this is the first set of notes for this new Unit 8. I'm going to try and do things a little bit differently. In the past, I've kind of had long sets of notes, and a few people complained that they were really lengthy, and I agree, they were pretty long. And so, in an effort to kind of pare down the notes, I've decided to split them up. So, this is actually one of two sets of notes on mollusks. Today, we're just going to look at general characteristics. And that should kind of make this a bit more of a smaller recording. And then we'll do a second set of notes later on this week that looks more in depth at the different subcategories within mollusks. Okay, so just a couple reminders. You should have picked up some resources, either handout or, yeah, I think it's a handout that you're filling in as you go. I'm going to try and leave some space, more like margins on the sides for you guys, so you have additional space to write additional information. If for some reason that doesn't work out, feel free to always write on the notebook page if you've run out of space and you need to add more information. Don't forget to check diagrams if you're missing, and if they're missing any labels, you should be filling those in. And that, yeah, make sure you either have captions or audio so that you are taking care to jot down things that you still need to that I talk about but aren't necessarily written on the slides. Okay, so same as usual. All right, let's get started. So mollusks, the phylum is called Mollusca, and so um, that Latin word molluscus means soft, and that actually is a very good description of a main characteristic of mollusks in that they are soft-bodied. So they have very delicate, soft body tissues, and then in order to protect those bodies, those soft bodies, they'll either have an external shell or sometimes some kind of internal shell that or structure that acts as like almost like a skeleton, providing some like rigidity. Okay, so mollusks come in a wide range. Snails, slugs, clams, squids, and octopi all fall under the phylum of mollusk. And so you're probably, if you've seen a lot of these things, you know that they are very diverse in the way that they look. Some of them have shells, some of them don't. So it's a little odd that they're all lumped together, but it has a lot to do with developmentally. Um, there's some similarities there. Okay, many mollusks within this wide range here share similar developmental stages, and we'll talk about that later on when we get to the reproduction area of these notes. Okay, so in terms of a main body plan, most mollusks have four parts to them. So these are the four parts. There's a foot, a mantle, a shell, and then a visceral mass. Okay, so we're going to look at all four of these in a little bit more detail here. By the way, if you ever need to refer back to these, refer back to the textbook, this chapter is from page 701 to 708. Okay, so you can always find more detail there. All right, so the muscular foot, that part of a mollusk, can take a variety of forms. This diagram is found on page 702, okay? And so if you look at the color coding here, you can see that the foot is kind of in a peachish pink color. So for snails, for example, the muscular foot actually is flat and on the ventral surface, okay? And so it's used for crawling. For bivalves like clams and mussels, the foot has this kind of spade shape to it, and it's actually used for digging. Um, clams and clams, for example, dig in the sand in order to kind of hide from predators, and so that helps them to kind of dig downwards into the sand. And then for mollusks like squid and octopi and cuttlefish, the foot actually is modified to have tentacles, and these are used for for capturing prey and for feeding. Okay, so that was the first structure that we mentioned, a foot. There's also something called a mantle. Okay, so mollusks, their main body has a mantle, and what a mantle is this layer of epidermal tissue that covers the visceral mass. Now, we'll talk about visceral mass on the next slide, but it's basically just all their internal organs. Okay, so the mantle is kind of like a protective skin, not including the shell, but a protective skin that kind of covers all of the internal organs and separates the internal organs from the outside. Okay, the mantle also does an important thing in when it comes to mollusks that have a hard shell, such as like this scallop right here. The mantle actually secretes a substance that like the mantle sometimes has these glands that will secrete calcium carbonate, and that's the tough material that makes these shells. Um, and so for the mollusks that do have hard shells, the mantle has that extra job. Okay, the third structure body of the body of a mollusk is a shell. Not all mollusks have shells, like octopi don't have them, and squids, but for the ones that do, the shell acts as a protection for the softer part of the mollusk. Okay, so like the scallop here or this oyster. Um, Now, the disadvantage to that is if you recall with simpler organisms like worms that we learned about in the previous unit, um, in order to get oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, simpler organisms used to just allow respiratory gases to travel through the skin. So the disadvantage to having a shell is that you now have part of the skin of the organism kind of covered by this hard structure, and that means less surface area available for exchanging gases. Now, the way that mollusks that have hard shells kind of work around this disadvantage is they evolved gills. And so mollusks that have a hard shell, and actually mollusks in general, is where we start to see kind of across the board the development of gills for respiration. Okay, and then the last main part of the body plan of most mollusks is something called the visceral mass that I mentioned earlier. Now, in this diagram, you can see a comparison of a snail, a clam, and a squid, which are representations of each of the main kind of categories of mollusks. You can see in blue all of those various organs and come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and tubes and so on. These are the visceral masses of each of these organisms. So their job, they're basically the internal organs, ranging anywhere from a digestive tract to a heart, to gills, and so on. They're all kind of lumped in together as the visceral mass. Okay, in terms of feeding, mollusks actually, there's a wide range of different types of feeding strategies. So there are mollusks that are herbivores, they feed on plants, carnivores, filter feeders, detritivores, parasites. They all do have a complete digestive tract, meaning mouth to anus, like one long tube. But I mean, obviously, there might be some differences in the way that the lengths of those digestive tubes and so on. But all the components are there, just like what we saw with annelid worms. Um, but there are a couple of structures that are unique for some types of mollusks. So one such example is something called a radula. Okay, so a radula is a kind of tongue-shaped structure that has little hundreds of these tiny teeth on them. And here you can see like a side cross section of this looks like a snail or a slug, and it's basically like this mouth part that has lots of little teeth on them. And if we're talking about um, a mollusk that's a herbivore, like some snails and slugs, they'll use that radula to scrape off. There we go. To scrape off algae from rocks or to eat the soft tissues of plants. However, there are some mollusks that are carnivorous, and so they actually have modified radulas where they might use it to either drill through the shells of their prey or tear up and swallow the soft tissues of their prey. Okay, so they're not, radulas are not just found in herbivores, they're found in carnivores too. Oops, I should probably mention this is one example of a method of feeding, but as we're gonna see in a moment here, um, there's one group of mollusks called bivalves, and they actually are filter feeders. Okay, so like clams, oysters, and scallops have a modified um, means of getting food, and that's through something called a siphon, which is a tube that they use for bringing water in and out to filter out food. Okay, and actually, this right here is what the siphon is. But first, let's just talk about. We'll move on to respiration, and then I think on the next slide I mention it a little bit more in detail. So, in terms of respiration, uh, most when it comes to land dwelling mollusks like land snails and slugs, they still have the ability to respire by diffusion. So, what they do is they don't have gills like aquatic mollusks do. Instead, they have like a cavity in their mantle where they have lots of blood vessels kind of lining the cavity. And so, when they take in air, gas exchange happens that way. So, um, they technically can exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen directly with the air. However, for aquatic mollusks, they'll use gills, and you can see in blue here, it's showing what the gills look like inside a cavity inside of the mantle. Okay, and so the way that it works is water kind of gets pulled into um, the mollusk in through one of the siphons. It's called the in-current siphon, and the water will go in and kind of flow over the gills. And as the water is flowing over the gills, oxygen will get pulled from the water. Carbon dioxide will be excreted into the water, and then that water afterwards will go out the excurrent siphon. Now, this same kind of flow or movement of water is also how these sorts of organisms, these sorts of mollusks, feed, because they'll filter out, they'll kind of use the fact that these gills have water flowing over them to catch food. So these gills keep kind of are covered with like a sticky mucus. And so what ends up happening is as water kind of flows over the gills, plankton, little microorganisms in the water get trapped in the mucus, and then those trapped plankton will kind of be swept towards the mouth to be eaten. Okay, in terms of circulation, um, there are actually examples of both types of circulatory systems in mollusks. So most mollusks have what's called an open circulatory system. Now that doesn't mean that blood kind of spills out of the animal. An open system kind of works like this. So you have a heart. So this mollusk has a heart right here, and the heart still does the same job in that it pumps blood. But instead of just being the heart and then lots of different blood vessels, you can see if you kind of follow the pathway of this blood vessel, eventually it's actually open ended. And so what happens is this heart will pump blood. This blood will travel through the vessels from this heart and then kind of open up into empty sinuses or like sac-like spaces within the mantle of the mollusk. That blood then kind of flows in that empty space, uh, flowing over the gills to the gills where that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange is going to happen. And so it kind of flows throughout and then eventually will make its way to a vessel where it'll return back to the heart again, to be pumped again. Okay, so it's unfortunately it's not a very efficient system, but it works for a lot of slow moving mollusks like clams and mussels and snails and slugs. Okay, the mollusks that move very quickly, like squids and octopi and cuttlefish, an open circulatory system wouldn't be good enough. And so these types of organisms, which are called cephalopods, they have a closed circulatory system, which just means that this actually isn't open-ended. It'll be technically it's a blood vessel that might branch out even further, but eventually it'll return right back to the beginning again, and the blood doesn't actually go into sort of any open cavities or sinuses inside of the mollusk. Okay, in terms of excretion, um, there are nephridia with mollusks as well. If you recall nephridia, we talked about with annelid worms, and they pretty much do the same sort of job. So cells of the body of this mollusk will produce waste, nitrogen-containing waste. That waste makes its way into the bloodstream, or not in the bloodstream, but into the blood, and then nephridia like this. Oh, it's pointing weird. It's technically this right here. You might want to adjust that on your slide, sorry. But nephridia like this then have the job of filtering that waste out of the blood, and then having that waste then get secreted from the body. Solid waste will exit through the anus, which is right here, but also this waste from the nephridia will be excreted that way as well. Okay, response, which remember has to do with any sort of nervous system. There is a wide variety of nervous systems and abilities to respond to the environment, depending on the type of mollusk as well. So there are some mollusks within this phylum that are quite simple and don't really need a very complex nervous system. So clams and other two-shelled organisms, they have a very simple nervous system. So they might have a few ganglia, a few nerve cords, some simple sense organs like eye spots or chemical receptors, but that's about it. Not very much is needed. However, in contrast, there are a lot of organisms, a lot of mollusks, like octopi, but also their relatives, like squid and cuttlefish and nautiluses, that are active and intelligent predators. So they have to have a highly developed nervous system with a brain. In fact, a lot of these cephalopods, which are kind of octopi and their relatives, um, can be can be quite intelligent, even more intelligent than some vertebrates. And I'll try and find a couple of sample videos, but if you ever just like search on YouTube, you can see a lot of experiments that are done with octopi, where they're able to do complex behaviors like solving problems, opening jars, even to get food that's trapped inside, or doing different tasks, escaping small spaces, things like that. So they're really very intelligent. It just goes to show that there's a wide range of nervous systems within this particular phylum. Okay, movement. So mollusks move in different ways. You have some mollusks like this snail here that use, or this clam, that use their foot. So like a snail, for example, will produce like a mucus trail, and then their foot, which is this right here, kind of glides almost like an ice skater would skate on a pond. They make this mucus trail so that they can kind of glide along, and their foot kind of has this rippling wave movement to help them kind of skate along. Certain mollusks like this clam here will use their foot actually as like a spade and dig into the sand to avoid predators or to bury themselves for protection. And then you have some mollusks like octopi and squid, for example, that can even use their siphon actually as like almost like a little jetpack, and they'll draw in water and then kind of shoot water out through the siphon, and that helps them to like dart away and travel very quickly to either go after prey or avoid a predator. All right, in terms of reproduction, a lot of variety as well. So external fertilization is used for a number of mollusks. Remember, external fertilization means they release their eggs and sperm cells out into the water, and then and a lot of snails do that, like aquatic snails, um, and a lot of two-shelled mollusks. For example, mussels or oysters, they do it that way. They do this that way as well. And what they'll do is they'll release their eggs into the water in large numbers, and then the eggs get fertilized, and those fertilized eggs um, turn into these free swimming larvae called trochophores. And I think on the next slide I have an image of what a trochophore looks like, but they're microscopic. They're very, very tiny, and then eventually those will develop from that larvae stage into adulthood. Here is what a trochophore looks like, really up close, but you can tell it looks, as you can see, it looks absolutely nothing like any of the mollusks we've seen so far, and it's microscopic, and eventually this would develop into, this has the potential to, depending on where it came from, could develop into a mussel or a clam, or a sea slug, or sea snail. Okay. Now this trochophore larva is actually also characteristic of annelid worms. There are a lot of annelids that kind of reproduce in the same way, and that's actually a reason why this unit, or mollusks, are a good thing to talk about after we just went over annelids. There's evidence to show that they might be closely related because of this developmental kind of feature. Okay. Ooh, I should also mention, so there are some mollusks that are hermaphrodites. Oh, actually, I think I have it here. So tentacled mollusks like octopi and squid, and certain snails have internal fertilization. So that's where a female actually has the fertilization take place inside of her. Okay, and then you also have some mollusks that are hermaphrodites. Now, remember, with hermaphrodites, that doesn't necessarily mean that one organism will fertilize its own eggs. In fact, pretty much all the time, it's just that these mollusks that are hermaphrodites have both male and female parts. And so, if you were to have two individuals, um, mate with each other, they would just be able to fertilize each other's eggs. They don't ever fertilize their own. They still need another set of genetic material that comes from another individual. Okay, and lastly, just quickly to at least list the groups of mollusks. So these are the three major classes of mollusks, but like I said, we're going to have another set of notes that looks at them more in detail. So the first class are called gastropods, and then the second are bivalves, and the third are cephalopods. Okay, so gastropods, some examples would be like snails, slugs, things called limpets. If you've ever seen like abalone, which is a type of large sea snail, kind of falls into that same category. Bivalves would be like mussels, clams, oysters, scallops. That's what bivalves would be. And then cephalopods would be like octopi, squids, cuttlefish, and also something called a nautilus, which we'll look at as well. Okay, And I believe that's it. All right. Thanks, you guys.